Hi everyone, in this lesson we are going to learn how to talk about how we travel to work in the morning. Same as always, we will begin with a model dialogue, and in this dialogue the two people are talking about how they travel to work in the morning. After the dialogue we will explain all the expressions in detail. How do you get to work? I always take the subway. How about you? I often drive to work. Okay, so first to ask how the other person travels to work, we can ask, how do you get to work? How do you get to work? The verb get is one of the most common verbs in English. And one meaning of the verb get is to arrive. So when we ask, how do you get to work? It means, how do you arrive at work? And the noun work refers to one's place of work. So it could refer to someone's office, factory, restaurant, or any place the person works. Here are two more example sentences. How do you get to the office? How do you get to school? Let's practice asking these questions. How do you get to work? How do you get to the office? How do you get to school? Great job, well done. Next, to answer this question, we can say, I always take the subway. I always take the subway. When we talk about using a certain form of transport as a passenger, we can use the verb take. So we can say, I always take the bus, I always take the train, or I always take a taxi. In these phrases, we use the with bus and train as they are part of a transport network. However, for taxis, we're generally talking about an individual taxi car, which is not part of a transport network. So we use the article a. Lastly, always is an adverb we use to say we do something 100% of the time. So the person in the dialogue is saying that they take the subway to work every day of the week. Let's practice saying these sentences. I always take the subway. I always take the bus. I always take the train. I always take a taxi. Excellent job, well done. Now, instead of being a passenger, if you are the driver of a car and you drive to work, you can say, I often drive to work. I often drive to work. Now, if we are not passengers and instead are the ones in control of a vehicle, we use the verb related to driving that vehicle to talk about going to work in that form of transport. So if I get to work in the morning by driving my own car, then I would use the verb to drive and say, I drive to work. There are two other verbs we used in this way. One is to cycle, to talk about riding a bicycle, and the other is to walk, to talk about walking to work. So we can say, I often cycle to work. I often walk to work. The adverb often relates to how we do something regularly. And when we use often, it means that we do something about 4 or 5 times a week. When we pronounce this word, we can pronounce the T and say often, often. However, we can also say it without pronouncing the T, often, often. So in this lesson, we will continue to practice in this way by not pronouncing the T in often. Okay, so let's practice saying these sentences. I often drive to work. I often cycle to work. I often walk to work. Excellent job, well done. Okay, so before we do the final practice, let's listen to that dialogue again. How do you get to work? I always take the subway. How about you? I often drive to work. Okay, so let's now do a speaking practice of this dialogue. We will do 2 speaking practices so that you can practice both roles. All the lines will be on the screen, so when it's your turn, please read the line and participate in the dialogue. How do you get to work? I often drive to work. I always take the subway. How about you? Fantastic job today, well done. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned how to talk about how we travel to work in the morning. The next lesson is, as always, the speaking drill lesson, so make sure to take that lesson for more speaking practice. See you soon again. Bye bye.